Looks like we have a packed house tonight. So really excited you guys are here because we're going to be talking about Twinmotion, not just an introductory or how to use the tool or go to any sort of high-level Twinmotion capabilities. I'll be speaking about how we at Olson Kundig utilize Twinmotion, and specifically with this project, which we'll get into in a little bit. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Greg Rogers, and I am the Director of Visualization at Olson Kundig. I've been there about 1.5 years, and my position there is essentially helping to manage the internal visualization capabilities with our architects and interior designers, our own visualization team, our 3D rendering capabilities there, and then also a lot of R&D and working with external resources to help us push our visualization capabilities even further. So first, I'd like to give an intro to Olson Kundig, in case you've never heard of them. We are based out of Seattle. This is a team photo. We've essentially doubled in size in the last year or so, and we're essentially around 275 full-time employees based out of our headquarters in Seattle, which we've been there for a very long time. And we just entered the New York market and opened up our second headquarters in New York. So here's just the scope and breadth of our work with a lot of focus on the residential sector. General map of where our projects are. And you can see we are global, but a lot of our focus is in the Pacific Northwest. So we're kind of here to talk about, FYI, this timer is not on, by the way. Now it is. Just gave myself an extra few minutes. I could have waited 10 minutes and then said, but that's fine. So we're kind of here to talk about why does Olson Kundig choose to implement real-time rendering technology? And it's a really interesting question to ask, and especially if you have so many architects and designers working every day, building projects in BIM software and using rendering engines kind of like Enscape, because that's sort of the go-to for a lot of architecture firms. But what if we want to take it a bit further? So what is real-time technology focusing in Twinmotion? And we'll get into that path into Unreal Engine 5 as well. But generally, why do we want to invest the time into it? If we want to take our visualizations to the next level, the idea of no additional 3D modeling software training is really, really important. Because if, let's say, we want to take them out of Revit and bring them into 3D Max and teach them V-Ray and Corona, they need to learn 3D Max, and who's going to do that, right, at scale? It's a very difficult software to learn, and then all of a sudden the licensure costs go way up. Thanks, Autodesk, right? So it's almost like we don't have to resort to massive training in 3D software just to get them to that next level. It's kind of unfair to ask them to learn an additional software when they have so much more work to do on the design side. Another thing is that we often run into issues when working in the Revit world with programs like Enscape. There are some limits when it comes to vegetation. So we're looking to explore a deeper landscape ecosystem and vegetation ecosystem. And as we know, it's obviously we're going to be talking about Megascans and Quixel and their capabilities and how intuitive it is. And speaking of that, intuitive lighting and material creation is something that needs to happen more easily for designers and people using software. It has to be easy to do. The days of really spending way too much time implementing the lighting and really deep material creation when you really just want to kick out beautiful images, and I think that's what real-time technology can really do. And if you think about the shelf life of a still rendering or something like that, if you're using programs like V-Ray, Corona, or Enscape, it has an end to it. You can't take it much further. So therefore, if you think about Twinmotion being the entryway into real-time technology and where we want to be in a couple of years as a visualization team is Unreal Engine 5, so we can keep that train moving and explore different avenues even further. So that's why we're investing the time to learn real-time rendering technology. So my beautiful graph here that shows things that we all know, and maybe there are some things that you're unfamiliar with, but these are the softwares we use. But throughout this presentation, I'm going to speak not only about the visualization team and what we did on the 3D Max path to get into Twinmotion, but also talk about how our Revit users and our architects and designers, why we are investing it on that level. So it's not just this particular project in 3D Max, but how the Revit and Twinmotion workflow is solving a lot of issues that we have as designers. And we'll be talking about a lot of these different things, especially 3D scanning. And when we start talking about the project as we get into it, there will be 4 main chapters involved, where a lot of these things you'll see some real high-level finished imagery, a little bit of workflow, tips and tricks, things that I've learned, lessons learned, that I feel like new users, advanced users could learn a lot from. So before we get into that even further, I want to talk about the design team and the actual project in particular. Here we have Tom Kundig, Steve Grimm, Lesa, and Greg Faulkner. And this particular project was a collaboration between both architects, right? And so what does that really mean? So during the design process, Olson Kundig's design sketches on the left were 4 different iterations, and I'm sure there are plenty more. But then the client decided to take pieces of each of those design iterations and kind of put them together like a little puzzle and come up with their own sort of scheme, a little back and forth, and then you have the final layout here. So again, we're going to jump into the chapters, but the images you see are all done in Twinmotion, surprise, and that they are little to no Photoshop at all. The only stuff that we did is we added a LUT file, maybe a quick curve here and there, but generally this is right out of the box. And we use the path tracer in all the images you see. So these are the 4 chapters we'll start getting into. The architecture side, we'll also start talking about the 3D Max and modeling portion of it. So as we begin to frame our views and start creating images in Twinmotion, the most important workflow we like to start off with is I always think that creating the cameras first when you get the model in is the most important thing you could do, because you don't want to give yourself too much work and then not utilize that area that you focus on. So even if you're not going to use all the cameras, we like to set up our cameras as close to architectural photography as we can. And so I think it's important for us to nail down what we see so we can start framing views. And we'll get deeper into, I made a little note in the corner with Quixel, and we'll start getting into how we use Quixel to frame views with certain pieces from Megascans, how we scatter, how we paint, and all these things. Another example of how we frame our views to showcase the architectural design, because there's a lot about this project that really is bringing the inside out, open floor plans and layouts to really transition from the outdoors in, and really understanding how light kind of reacts to the designs. Of course, we put the Twinmotion cat in our image. He's just sitting right there enjoying it. And I think another element that you're going to see a lot of really custom pieces, like what you see on the left, that's an Olson Kundig design, and that gate sort of moves up and down this track. So really understanding how these things, from certain points of view, look within the space, and understanding how we can work in the file and be able to move that and animate that gate back and forth for the client really easily with a lot of the tools in Twinmotion. Just a fun little heads up, we've been seeing a lot of different pine cones. There's a very special section of this presentation focusing on pine cones. So please make sure you're attentive during that section. But again, another example of how we are setting up cameras more architecturally to showcase our design. And as we get into the more storytelling elements, sometimes as a creative, it's so much better to have all the tools to mix and match at your disposal. Try and try again and fail, and know that's really easy to start over and do something else again, right? And I'd say about 5 years ago, prior to these asset libraries that are at our hands, we really had to overthink and plan ahead and purchase certain packs for $70 to only use once, or maybe just use the same rock that people have been using for the last 20 years. And so that sort of workflow I don't have to think about up front. It's really nice to know right when I get into Twinmotion, it's like, okay, I could tell many different stories in such a short amount of time. And so that branch was probably the 5th branch on the 5th rotation, or using the gravity tool. It took me a lot of times, but knowing that I had my camera set up and how I wanted to frame it, I was able to kind of curate the view with these assets really, really fast, and then make a few mistakes and realize that maybe that isn't the best composition I want to go with. So again, we're talking about the 3D Max path right here. The Revit direct link into Twinmotion is relatively straightforward. There's no detailing out the geometry, and with Revit, there are limitations to the amount of details you can get. So we bring this into 3D Max, rename the layers, because sometimes the Revit layer system is great for BIM, but not necessarily for visualization, and going in and being able to rename that, and categorizing it how we want, and grouping things together that makes sense from a visualization standpoint. But generally speaking, once brought into 3D Max, we just chamfer some edges and just remodel something or fix some normals, and that's really it. And then we bring in our high poly furniture, but there's very little work done in 3D Max to get into Twinmotion because the Revit model output is pretty clean, hopefully. So again, you'll see some sculpting, and we'll get into that as well with the mesh that you see that I subdivided closer. And that's a really important process of the Twinmotion workflow as well, but that'll be talked about in the vegetation side of things. And so Olson Kundig has a lot of custom-built furniture, gizmos, as we like to call it, things that move. And so that's the next step for us when we bring it into 3D Max, really modeling these things, because in Revit, as much as we'd love to have these one-off things as custom families, we just don't. We have placeholders. Maybe in the future, we will be able to incorporate these, but each one is custom. So we have a team of modelers, interns, who help kind of really define and really nail down these very specific light fixtures, furniture. This is a sculptor's work that we had to model. And then we'll get into what those other two, the fireplace and the grill. So really like a big tips and trick and lesson learned on how to prepare your model for Twinmotion. It is really how you prepare your site model and understanding what the limitations and capabilities are in Twinmotion when you use the vegetation. So what I've learned is that, you bring in your CAD site model and it's big and you don't want to scatter. If you're familiar with Twinmotion, how you scatter, it scatters based on the mesh and you click it once, twice to add more context to it, which is great, but if you have such a gigantic site map with tons of mountains, you don't really want to just bombard your file like that. So what I like to do is subdivide a particular region closest to the architecture. So within 3D Max, I can sculpt it a bit more because sometimes it's too jagged. I can smooth it out, and coming from the site from Revit, it's too janky sometimes, so bringing it up, and we'll see how the landscape kind of meets the building and how I kind of limit my sculpt area, right? Because you don't want to subdivide the entire thing because you quadruple your mesh count or your poly count, and you don't really want to do that. So I highly recommend understanding where your sculpting section would be, and then even further, understanding where you're going to want to scatter and or paint the vegetation within Twinmotion. Again, a gigantic site model. I like to get a decent radius away from the sculpt area, because the sculpt area is also where I'm going to focus on the more curated individual placement, little bit of paint, stuff like that. But this is almost like the site model is a tier 3, where it's just like a little bit of scatter and maybe some Photoshop background, if they release the material IDs in Twinmotion, because that would be great. And then I kind of just cut that piece out, create a different mesh, and that is a separate mesh in which we can scatter more densely because it's closer to the camera, it's more noticeable, but you're also controlling the amount and the file size of, where, just controlling the size and optimizing as where you can. And so one other fun plugin that we like to use, because a lot of projects are, they have a very dense winter season. And while the Twinmotion seasonal parameter is great, it's limited in height. That's fine, because they are trying to control how deep your file size can get. So we like to use PolySnow 3D for 3D Max. It's about $80 US. And it's pretty intuitive to get realistic snow on top of surfaces. And you click these surfaces, and then you can control it. You can do icicles. You can do a whole lot with this. So this, paired with Twinmotion, is you get some really great results, right? It's just fun. I mean, if you play around with the snow, it's like the most fun. So as we talk about vegetation, I wanted to quickly talk about what the architects need from what they need. And some of our principal designers are like, oh, great, these Enscape trees or these Revit trees, they just are not realistic. Our client does not want to see this. We need to adapt. We need to be better. And while doing that in Photoshop is achievable with some of these really incredible 2D packs, that's just an added program and added hours. Why can't we do it in 3D? Real-time is a solution for that as they develop and further their vegetation capabilities, both within Twinmotion. They're supposed to release hundreds of new trees, which I'm really excited about, but then also incorporating Megascans as needed. Again, this talks about the curated views. I had this camera set up, so all the rock placement and all the bushes are very independently added. Right? And you'll see some of the, I had to do some more sculpting around the edges because it gets tricky, and so that's where the subdivision comes into play. And then you're able to kind of tie it in together so it doesn't look as sharp, and the triangles don't show as much. And you can also see there's a little bit of paint, the little grass patches. Those are just a little bit. You don't want to go crazy. You kind of really just want to just control the amount you add, because sometimes you can't go back. You can start erasing, but per view, it's really nice to be able to curate it even further. Again, look at all these pine cones. And the individual placement of trees are within that blue sculpted area. That's where you focus. That's kind of where you can bring it to life and change the maturity level of one tree, or go into Sketchfab and find that one high poly tree that you hate that it's so heavy, but you're still going to bring it in because it looks good. Only use it once to frame your view, great. And then I think more of the vegetation paint and the Megascan surfaces are really, really help to bring this to life. So as we continue with the vegetation, you'll see more of how the tiered scattering kind of comes into play. So in the background, you could kind of see a little hint of that area, but in reality, past that, you don't see it. And that's maybe how you control the camera view, right? Maybe you don't want to rely on having to add more in that site map, and just, if you were to just lower your camera, look up a little bit, and so really defining those cameras early will then address how much vegetation scattering and painting you need to actually do. So again, highly recommend getting those cameras set right away. And I will admit that the tire marks are Photoshop. I would have felt bad if I left this conversation and not admitting that. So Twinmotion cannot do that. No. So I had to make sure everybody knows that. Again, going back to the storytelling and doing it in Twinmotion, it's just outstanding. Because you'll see another picture later where I used chopped wood, firewood from Megascans for a very particular view, and then it came into my head, because I saw something on Sketchfab of a photoscan grouping of logs. I said, that would be great, but it's 200 megabytes. I'm not going to do it. So then going back to Megascans, I just had fun just putting this under the deck. It was something I never even thought about when I was curating this image and going through the cameras and composition. Never came to my mind, but then it did, because of the ability to access a full library, an ecosystem. So these ideas come to you. So it's really, really great to experiment with. And then The framed view on the right, the tree, is a tree from Quixel that if you use them, you know that a lot of these trees are cut, and so there's no real purpose using them unless you're doing maybe some sort of tree graveyard. But they really come in play when you bring it closer to the camera. You can exaggerate it so you do see that detail and it frames that view. And then you could hide it in other cameras that you would see that cut top. So that's a really useful way of using those scans if you haven't really thought about, well, what's the point if they're cut? It's about like using it as composition. I think this is my favorite image of the set because it's everything that I've talked about so far. And the axe and the wood, again, the same exact thing with the chopped wood. I said, well, let's take it another step further. Where does the family chop the wood? And while it might not be realistic as to whatever that might be on site, compositionally, it adds that extra layer that's just not only fun for an artist, because working in Twinmotion, you start enjoying rendering again, when in the past you kind of get stuck and you're like, this is frustrating. So it's just really, really great to use the tools that are inherent and native to Twinmotion to create work. So I wanted to talk about the user library within Twinmotion. It's something I never really thought about using because I was just placing things everywhere, scrolling through the catalog of Megascans and Sketchfab, and then that was it. And then having to maybe go back to that library of Megascans to find that asset again or something similar as needed. Not only is the user library easy to set up and share, it's local to yours, and you could just create the folder system locally and add things there, or you could do it within Twinmotion from the layers and just adding to different groups. Very easy to do. But why I recommend it so much is to control and make your life easier when navigating and finding assets. So what you see on the left is a company I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's called Globe Plants. It's a website that does pretty high quality vegetation and landscape. And what they do is they help us create custom species when we can't find it. So when we have a project, very particular trees and species that we just don't have, they create them for us in whatever format we need. And some of them are now Twinmotion conversions. And while they are very good, they can be heavy. So the third-party assets can be heavy, so please be careful when you start investing and bringing them in. They look great, cool, amazing, but maybe one here, one there to frame it. But that's just a little heads up. But then on the right, with Quixel, why did I start my own Quixel folder? Is because as much as we love Megascans, we don't need 75 different branches as architectural visualizers, right? We only need maybe 10. Because while that library is so big and really great, scrolling through to find the perfect branch is kind of, I don't know, counterproductive for me. And even with rocks, or anything to decorate and design the scene, I like to add the ones that I like, maybe 5, and then add it to my own custom user library. So instead of going back to the Megascans, trying to find it and scrolling through the thousands of assets, I'll just start my own. And so that's a really good way for users to, when they're sharing projects, they know very easily where they can find the asset that was used and bring it into a new view if needed. So I recommend that kind of workflow for Megascans and Sketchfab assets. I often get asked, which is better and when to use it, and hopefully you kind of understand how I was curating the views, the tiered scattering, and all of that. Vegetation paint is heavier. Use it less often. I have one paint in that entire project. It's just that little grass elements that you see all around. That's it. Scatter is great as you have these tiered scattering systems. That's when I like to use it. Closer to the camera, it gets frustrating because you'll just repeat deleting areas. So I recommend scattering in areas that kind of are out of focus and just need to fill empty space, painting in that really nice sculpted area, and then curating individual placements to frame and composition. Don't scatter everything, don't paint everything, because your file size will skyrocket. And so that kind of gets to the point, and something I'm just going to speak to a lot, is that let Twinmotion be Twinmotion. Don't try and make it something that it's not. It's not Corona, it's not V-Ray, it's not Maxwell or whatever people use. Because a lot of times people don't understand that and they want something more from it. And then you try to bring in third-party assets and like, oh, well, we have to make it look exactly like something else. But I think the more you lean into the workflow of Twinmotion, the better quality of work you'll get and the less frustrating it'll be. But that's a lot about communicating what it is to your design teams or the stakeholders or anybody, really. Getting into lighting, again, talking about the architects and what they need. If you work in Revit, you know how frustrating it is to adjust lighting. It's not intuitive. It's great for BIM management and design, but once you enter Enscape or once you enter something else, you cannot, and this is just for the Revit workflow, you cannot add lights in Enscape. So you have to go back into Revit, mess with those parameters, and they're very technical, and you have to really, and then refresh in Enscape and see that maybe it was right, maybe it wasn't. And that's just not intuitive. So a lot of times our architects just rely on a very low sun and increasing some exposure and ambient light to just jump it in there, and then it's very harsh shadows, and the client's like, this is aggressive, and it's like, well, we can't get enough light in there. And so that becomes like a dead end, right? And then so bringing it into Twinmotion, it's just easy and fun again. And the only two lights I have in this scene are just those two. And when we chop up some of the 3D model and remodel some of the can lights, we make sure we separate a mesh or give it a different material ID so we could add an emissive material to those can lights. But generally, this is all we do. And for architects, it's so nice to see the lights come in and add those lights with ease and say, oh, this is what I wanted something to be. And after years of not having it, it's now at our disposal. I have to say that volumetric gray is Photoshop. Sorry. I know. I had to add it at the end because I just wanted to test and see what I could do in Photoshop because I found a really great file, but Twinmotion can't do that. But again, it's just nice to very quickly get very successful lighting with Path Tracer. And I think that this image has it all for me when it comes to lighting. It hits different areas, and again, it frames the Quixel scan as well. And sometimes, I know not everybody loves it, but I like to blow out the lighting a little bit and really bring that to life. And maybe that's not for everybody, but I think the point is that I'm able to do that and quickly go back or iterate on or have that as an option when we review work. And so I like to do it. I think it's a good look because you get these kind of bloom effects that are a bit more natural. And this goes back to also showcasing the architecture in framed views. The interior, being able to control the interior light in Twinmotion is just great. You can see the emissive material applied, the under-counter lighting, the lighting in this grill fireplace, which you'll see another photo of, and then just tying that in with a really soft light coming in and adjusting the temperatures and having that at your fingertips is just really intuitive for our designers and really great for our team to explore different creative capabilities. So I want to talk about the HDRIs within Twinmotion because it's amazing, it's great, it's full of capabilities, but I ran into some issues. Not issues, just things that I need to be aware of when I'm using HDRIs within Twinmotion that they don't really suggest in the documentation, but I found out later. Before we get into all those pink squares, I really want to reiterate that adding, and I had about 20 different views within Twinmotion, and sometimes I shared the same HDRI, but I had about 13 different HDRIs in my file. And 3 weeks before this conference, my file was up to 6 gigs, and once you get past 5 gigs of Twinmotion, it kind of acts up. It gets really tricky to manage. And so I thought it was painting, scattering, Sketchfab stuff, and I copied the file, I deleted all of that, but then I go online on the forums and they say, if you have a lot of different HDRIs in your file will crash and it will not work. So be careful. So I had to go in with each view, create an Excel spreadsheet, and figure out how many I had, and I was like, I have too many. And if you work in the world of HDRIs, you really only need like 5, right? And it's great that Twinmotion has just over with the Skylight HDRIs, close to 300 options. We don't, as architectural visualization, we don't need 300 different HDRIs. You need a few, right? Overcast, sunny, cloudy, night, dusk, dawn. That's it. And you really can't tell the difference between the 20 different overcast options when you add them into your scene. You can't. They're so minimal. And as much as you want to explore different things, I highly recommend finding 10 that you like, or maybe 5, and just use those. And stick to those, because your file size will skyrocket if you don't control the number, especially if you have a lot of different views. But when you do get into the world of HDRIs and you add them to your scene, you drag and drop it in, and you notice the change, and you might think that's what it's supposed to look like, but it's not. And I think it took me a little while to learn that every single one of these parameters per HDRI needs to work together to get it to what it's supposed to look like, or what you really want it to look like. I always turn auto exposure off, so I can control that very slightly. But once you drag and drop that HDRI, you need to adjust every single one of these parameters a little bit in any direction, and then you will see the HDRI do what it's supposed to. Because right when you drag and drop, it's just, you'll see it change, but just know that it's not the way it's supposed to look. And each HDRI needs to be a little different. So just a little heads up. Getting into materials. So exterior visualization with Twinmotion is great, beautiful. You have so many capabilities and options to do storytelling, but interior renderings with Twinmotion is a bit more challenging. And that's just how it is. And that maybe is a general rule of thumb with architectural visualization, but with Twinmotion, I think there is room to develop the material creation, navigation, and UI a little bit further. I don't think it's there yet, but it is very easy for first-time users within real-time technology to plug and play, apply materials, adjust them slightly, and get them to where they need to be. But advanced material creation is just not quite there yet. We are about 50% quick-fill surfaces within the project, 30% custom from manufacturers and things that had to be perfect, and then the rest were native materials within Twinmotion that did the job for what we needed. Again, the concrete were photographs from previous projects. And the rest of you see is pretty native to Twinmotion, except the floors. These aren't specific called out sculptures. Again, storytelling, using something as placeholders as a reference as the opportunity of that space for as we design. The image on the left, again, the material, that was a custom one, along with the other custom concrete. And this was the wood I was talking about, how that was the story of where they would typically keep wood for that grill. And so I was like, oh, well, this playing with the gravity and wood is fun. Let's put them under the deck and see what we can do with that. So with the little bit of frustration with the material workflow, my workaround is that find the materials you like, create these spheres from the Twinmotion spheres, apply your materials that you are using within the project, apply them to these spheres, group them, and then turn it off and on when you want to reference and find and sample that material to use it again. So that way you don't have to fly around your model to get to that bench to select that metal, right? You can have this as a group, and if you need to add more, then just add another sphere. This takes up no room within your project at all. Because the navigation of going into Twinmotion and finding that material, you have to scroll, the names are cut off, you can't see it, some of them look too similar, and you can't group them, you can't expand it. So my solution is to do this. Create these material preview groups. So You could turn them on, turn them off. Again, if you're sharing this project with colleagues, they want to go and find that, just like they want to go and find the assets in the user library. So those two things are pretty good workarounds for assets and materials. So it's time to talk about the pine cones, my favorite part. So as you've been seeing, the pine cones are everywhere, and I wanted to scatter pine cones, but Twinmotion doesn't have them. Neither does the ones in Quixel weren't good, and the one in Sketchfab was great, but you can't scatter Sketchfab stuff. You can't scatter Quixel stuff. So I didn't know what to do. I found the perfect pine cone, and within this project, in this region, there was a lot. And I really wanted to have fun with it. So I just wanted to show you kind of what my workaround was with that. So we're going to be talking about the gravity function. And so I will pull it up. My first approach was to instance all these pine cones in a grid, raise it up in the sky, and then use the gravity function. But then it became too linear, and you can notice I was just too repeated. So I essentially grouped all the pine cones, hundreds of them, overlapping each other, so the meshes are battling with each other. And then I just kind of accidentally figured out that this was working because I just didn't instance them further, so all of the geometry and mesh were overlapping, so it's just pure chaos happening. So if you were to and then that was just the best solution for me. And you could rotate it so they go sky high, and it was I had the best afternoon of my life doing this. That's how much I enjoy it. So I'm going to continue on, talk about some other, that was the video. We also do a lot of 3D scanning in Olson Kundig. This is a separate side chapter. And we use this for custom sculptures maybe our clients have, or pieces that we like to use in our visualization to not only take it to the next more realistic level, but use it for lighting studies that are more accurate. So software called Peel3D and that handheld scanner that you saw was our first investment to take 3D scanning into our visualization process. It's fun to use, it's pretty intuitive, there's a little bit of a learning curve, and then their proprietary software to clean up meshes and optimize it is unbelievable. This is a very, it's like the really high level, like really accurate way to 3D scan to get these in, so sometimes we lean on this workflow. And then we bring it into 3D Max. If you work in photogrammetry and scanning, your mesh is very, very heavy. Okay, you can put one of them in your scene, maybe two, but if we want to bring this into Unreal Engine 5, yes, nanite technology we can benefit from that, but ultimately we want to be able to control the level of detail with these scans, and so we invested in working with Instalod. Very, very, very easy software to retopo and remesh your objects, and then within seconds get LODs and bring your scan mesh down to something more manageable. Within this, the whole process of doing this was about 3 minutes. And then now we're ready to go into Unreal Engine 5 when we need to. And you can't tell the difference. It's the same. So anybody familiar with LODs, that's the whole point. But for us, it's a very, very great solution to optimize our scanned assets. But then we get into using capturing realities, RealityScan. We have been using it for months. I was lucky enough to get into the beta about 6 months ago and really testing out this as an option for our designers on site. So when this is publicly released, we will be training architects and designers to maybe go on site during construction to take photos of details or existing conditions to get maybe our client's artwork or any sort of detail on the floor or even any visual reference that we can then later process back in the office and have a 3D mesh of something on site that we never really were capable of before. So I think asking this from our designers is not so much because it's just taking a few photos here and there. But if you haven't signed up for the beta, you still can. Go to the RealityScan booth. I highly recommend it. We use it every single day. We scan sewer drains. We we scan absolutely everything. It's something you get addicted to, so I highly recommend kind of checking it out. Another one of my favorite images, and I want to wrap up by telling a really fun story, and if you know what this logo is, you know where I'm going with this. So Olson Kundig is leaning very heavily into AI generative imagery, both for conceptual images. We're doing a lot of R&D, but we're figuring out how we can use that as a firm. And what does that mean for architecture? Is it bad? Is it good? But what are some quick things that we can use for visualization? And some of that is creating, within minutes, different iterations of art. Because sometimes when you're in Photoshop and you want to put up artwork, you might go to Google and download some really famous artwork. It's kind of cheesy to just put a really famous Picasso in there and the client sees it and like, what are you doing? But with the AI and Midjourney, that's what this is, using Midjourney to very quickly use a style and an aesthetic to prompt us and give us some artwork that we could use in Photoshop. To not put a name of a famous art. We use famous artists to create work, but we're not tying ourselves to like a famous painting that can be a bit awkward in architectural visualization, especially with copywriting. If it goes public, they say, well, maybe, or some other local artist that you downloaded from a local Seattle artist. That's just maybe not fair for them us to illegally use their work. The copyright issue with AI is yet to be discussed. It's in the forefront of kind of what does that mean if we're using this? What are the copyrights of the artists that were involved in the prompt? We will have that conversation soon, but for now we're using it to kind of maybe create work that ties more into our aesthetic as Olson Kundig, where we might not have it. So even just a color palette to match up more of our furniture or connect more with nature or connect more with our client. So this is something we're exploring amongst many other things. So let's end with some render versus reality because the project is finished. My favorite image, but in winter. The axe just happens to still be there. I don't know how that happened. So these are always great to see. Of course, you can see the differences, but I'm happy with the results that Twinmotion can give us with such little stress, especially if you really understand. And again, if you let Twinmotion be Twinmotion, you will see your best results, and you will have a lot more fun with it. And I think you will become successful and then get yourself really revved up to get into Unreal Engine 5. So thank you for coming out and listening to me speak on Twinmotion with Olson Kundig. Thank you.